Hey folks, welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to focus on using SQS queues with auto-scaling. So in the DevOps doctrine, let's go into SQS with auto-scaling. Now for our scenario, we're going to have a web app which receives orders from customers. The app places the orders in an Amazon SQS queue until they are picked up for processing. Now we're going to simulate this part. We're going to create an SQS queue, and we will populate it with messages. So we'll have an auto-scaling group behind our SQS queue, and we're going to create CloudWatch alarms based on queue size. So based on queue size, when an alarm is triggered to scale out, our auto-scaling group will scale out, and likewise, after we process enough messages, it will scale back in. Now, this is one scenario, but really, this architecture could be used for any number of scenarios. Video transcoding, message processing, processing background jobs. Any situation where you have a large number of messages or processes that you can place in a queue and utilize an auto-scaling group to process the information in your queues would fit for this architecture. Let's go over to SQS and we'll get started. And let's select a first in, first out queue. Let's just call it SQS for ASG. And we'll see with a FIFO queue, we need this FIFO suffix. And let's just quick create our queue. So we will come back to this later. Now let's create an auto-scaling group. First, create a launch configuration. Amazon Linux AMI, T2 Micro free tier eligible, give it a name, and a role. And I have a role for auto-scaling. Let's go into advanced details and assign a public IP address. Always want that if you have any intention of SSHing into your instances. Skip to review. Let's create a new key pair and download it. Create launch configuration. All right, now we can create our auto-scaling group. We'll call it ASG for SQS. And let's just start with one instance. Let's select a subnet. Let's keep this at its initial size. We're going to go out to the CLI and finish our configuration. So let's create our auto-scaling group. And there it is. Now we're going to bounce out to the CLI, but let's take a last look at our diagram. So from the CLI, we're going to create our scaling policy, create our CloudWatch alarms, and we can verify these from the CLI. And then we're going to test scale out and scale in by increasing and decreasing the size of our SQS queue. That size is going to trigger our scale out and scale in. So let's bounce over to a terminal. And before we do that, let's grab our SQS information. After running a chmod on our key pair, let's SSH in. All right, so we're into our instance. Let's clean up our screen. Okay. So we're going to create a scale out policy for our auto-scaling group. So we provide our context, and the command is put scaling policy. We need to provide the policy name, and let's call it SQS-scale-out. We need to provide the name of our auto-scaling group, ASG for SQS. Specify a scaling adjustment of 1. And an adjustment type, change in capacity. Let's run that. All right, I'm not going to edit out my typo. Lesson learned. Let's try that again. Okay, so after specifying the region, no error message, this indicates success. And we're getting our policy ARN. Now, we want to save that ARN. We're going to need it later. So I'm copying that to the clipboard. And just in case I forget it's there, I'm going to copy it, just paste it into a document somewhere. Okay, so we're scaling out. Now it makes sense. We need to scale in. And we do that with our put scale in policy name, SQS scale in, auto scaling group name, ASG for SQS, scaling adjustment, note, -1, adjustment type change in capacity. And no error message, that worked for us. Again, we want to save this ARN, and it is different from the previous one. Okay, so we have our scale out and scale in policies, but we need to trigger these, and we trigger these via CloudWatch alarms. And we can create these alarms from the command line interface. Now this is a really long command. Looks intimidating, but let's break it down. We set our context, and our command is put metric alarm. We need to provide the alarm name, add capacity to process queue, metric name, approximate number of visible messages, namespace, AWS, SQS, statistic average, period, 300, otherwise known as 5 minutes, threshold 3. So when there are 3 messages in the queue, an alarm should be triggered. Comparison operator, greater than or equal to threshold, dimensions, name, the queue name, and our value is SQS for ASG.FIFO. Evaluation periods 2, alarm actions, and this is where we need to provide the ARN for the scale out. I actually inadvertently ran that, so that ran without any errors. Now we need to do the same for the scale in. Same thing. Put metric alarm name, remove capacity from process queue. All of the same information. Our threshold is 1. So when our queue size is less than or equal to our threshold, we're going to scale in. This will throw an alarm and trigger a scale in. Dimension, queue name, value, name of our SQS queue, and then I just have to paste in the ARN, and as soon as I do so, it's probably going to run. All right, so some very long commands, typo free, they both ran. Let's clean that up. Now we got no error messages, but we still can verify all of this. So AWS CloudWatch, describe alarms, and providing our alarm names. And there we go. There's our ARN, and there's our scale in ARN as well. Scale out and scale in. So we're good to go with our alarms. Let's clear our screen again. And we can also verify our scaling policies, and we just have to specify our auto scaling group name. Scale in, scaling adjustment -1, and then there's our scale out, scaling adjustment 1. From the management console, we're looking at our SQS queue. So what we're going to do is create 3 or more messages to trigger our alarm and our scaling. All right, so just a short message again. When we're evaluating the message size, it's the number of messages, not really the overall bulk of the messages. So this will be fine. Message group ID and message deduplication ID. And I actually just got these numbers from the AWS documentation. These will be fine. So let's click send message. May take up to 60 seconds for the messages available column to update. Let's call this test 2. And let's try one more. Okay. Now I'm just about ready to send the 3rd message. And that's our trigger number. Okay. Now I have another tab open. Let's bounce over to our auto scaling group. All right. And we see that another instance is launching, triggered by our SQS queue having 3 messages available. So we now have our scale out for our auto scaling group tied to our SQS queue size via a CloudWatch alarm, all done from the CLI. And we don't have any lifecycle hooks, and our new instance is in service already. So we're scaling out successfully. Now, what about scale in? Well, we don't have an application consuming these messages, but we can certainly alter the size of our queue. Let's do a purge. They're just test messages, so let's just purge it. All right, queue size is now 0. That certainly should trigger a scale in. And I did that pretty quick. We're in the midst of a 5-minute cooldown period. That time should be up very shortly, and we should see our scale in. There goes our little instances may be in the process of launching or terminating in order to match desired capacity. So it recognized our scale in alarm, and it's beginning to scale in. In progress, terminating EC2 instance. All right. So we've created an SQS queue, we've created a launch configuration and an auto scaling group. From the CLI, we created our scale out and scale in policies. We created CloudWatch alarms. And we've successfully tested our scale out and our scale in. So we've successfully configured SQS with AWS auto scaling. So go ahead and mark this lesson complete, and let's move on to the next.